up in the granite spine of the Windcliffs, where only mule deer and ghosts roam free, mountain man Thorne Malloy lived quiet with his dog, Jasper, a half-wild mutt with a nose for storms and liars alike. When a lone hiker stumbled onto their trail, saying he'd lost his way, Thorne offered water, not trust. The man talked too fast, eyes always moving. Jasper, ears flat, circled once, then lunged straight for the hiker's pack. What came next hushed even the wind. From that pack tumbled a pistol, rolled maps, and a Marshal's badge crossed out with a blade. More shocking was a worn photograph of Thorne's brother, who'd vanished 10 winters back after leaving to testify in a murder trial. But if this stranger carried proof of his brother's fate, what dark truth had been hunting Thorne all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stranger lay crumpled against a boulder, his neck twisted at an angle that spoke of finality. Jasper sat nearby, hackles still raised, watching Thorne sort through the scattered contents of the pack with methodical precision. Each item told a story, and none of them good. Thorne Malloy had spent the better part of 43 years learning to read signs, animal tracks in fresh snow, the way storm clouds gathered over distant peaks, the subtle shift in a man's voice when truth gave way to lies. Living alone in the Windcliffs had honed these skills to a razor's edge. Now, as morning light filtered through the pine canopy, those same instincts told him his solitary life was about to end. The photograph in his weathered hands showed Samuel at 25, still wearing that cocky grin that had gotten him into trouble since boyhood. They'd been inseparable once, two brothers against the world, until the world proved bigger and meaner than either had imagined. Samuel had inherited their father's sense of justice, always stepping between the bully and the bullied, always believing right would triumph over might. Thorne had been more practical, more cautious. That caution had kept him alive up here in the mountains, while Samuel's righteousness had led him down a darker path. The cabin Thorne called home sat in a natural clearing, surrounded by towering pines and granite outcroppings that provided both shelter and concealment. He'd built it with his own hands 12 years ago, after Samuel had vanished, and the questions became too hard to answer. Every log had been cut and fitted with the care of a man who expected to live his final days in this place. The roof was steep enough to shed snow, the walls thick enough to keep out the bitter mountain cold. A stone chimney rose from the center, its smoke the only sign of human habitation for miles in any direction. Inside, the cabin reflected a man who valued function over comfort. A simple bed occupied one corner, its frame built from lodgepole pine. A table and 2 chairs. He'd kept the second chair out of habit, though no one had sat in it for years, dominated the main room. Shelves lined the walls, holding preserved food, ammunition, and the tools necessary for mountain life. And there, on a small table beneath the single window, sat his most prized possession, a chess set he'd carved during the long winter nights when missing Samuel felt like a physical ache. Each piece had been shaped with painstaking care, whittled from different woods to distinguish the armies. The white pieces were aspen, pale and smooth, while the black were carved from walnut, dark and rich. The pawns were simple, functional, but the major pieces showed hours of detailed work. The knights' horses reared on hind legs, manes flowing. The bishops wore robes that seemed to move in the firelight. The king and queen bore crowns that caught the eye and held it. Thorne had learned chess from Samuel, who'd picked up the game from a traveling preacher with time on his hands and wisdom to share. They'd played for hours by lamplight, Samuel always aggressive, always pushing forward, while Thorne preferred the slow build, the careful positioning. Their father used to joke that their chess styles reflected their natures. Samuel the warrior, Thorne the tactician. Now standing over a dead man who'd carried his brother's photograph, Thorne felt those tactical instincts kicking in. The stranger had come looking for him specifically. The crossed-out badge suggested law enforcement gone bad. The maps showed the mountain passes, marked with what looked like planned routes. This wasn't a chance encounter, it was an assassination attempt that had Gone wrong when Jasper's animal instincts had trumped human calculation. Jasper himself was a testament to the unpredictable nature of mountain life. Thorne had found him 3 winters back, a half-grown pup with wolf in his bloodline and intelligence in his eyes. Someone had shot his mother and left him to die in the snow. Thorne had nursed him back to health, and the dog had repaid that kindness with unwavering loyalty and an uncanny ability to sense danger. Jasper could smell a storm 2 days out, could track a wounded deer across bare rock, and apparently could identify a killer masquerading as a lost hiker. The dog now sat watching as Thorne wrapped the dead man's belongings in an oiled cloth. Among the items were things that made his blood run cold: a detailed map of the settlement 10 miles down the mountain, photographs of several local families, and a list of names written in careful script. His own name topped the list, but others followed. Sarah McBride, the widow who ran the settlement's general store; Tom Fletcher, who operated the mill; Jake Morrison, the blacksmith. Good people who'd never hurt anyone, whose only crime was living in the same valley where Thorne had chosen to hide. The settlement of Pine Ridge had grown up around a natural spring and a convenient crossing where 2 mountain streams converged. It was small, maybe 40 souls on a good day, but it represented civilization in a wilderness that could be brutally unforgiving. Thorne visited perhaps once a month, trading game meat and hides for supplies he couldn't make or grow himself. He spoke little during these visits, conducting his business with the quiet efficiency that mountain folk respected. But over the years, he'd come to care about these people in the way a distant uncle might care about nephews and nieces. Sarah McBride had been particularly kind, always having a cup of coffee waiting when he came to trade. Her husband had died in a mining accident 5 years back, leaving her to raise 2 young children and run the store. She possessed the kind of strength that came from necessity rather than choice, handling both grief and responsibility with a grace that reminded Thorne of their mother. Sarah had asked about his past exactly once, early in their acquaintance, and when he'd deflected the question, she'd never asked again. That kind of respect for privacy was rare and precious. Tom Fletcher ran the grist mill that served the entire valley, grinding grain into flour and meal for families scattered across hundreds of square miles. He was a soft-spoken man with gentle hands and a quick smile for the children who came with their parents to trade. Tom had lost his left arm in the war, but had adapted his mill to work with one hand, never complaining, never asking for pity. He read voraciously, ordering books by mail and sharing them freely with anyone who showed interest. Jake Morrison, the blacksmith, was perhaps closest to a friend that Thorne had in the valley. They shared the understanding that came from working with their hands, from taking raw materials and shaping them into something useful. Jake could fix anything made of metal and create tools that lasted generations. He'd made the iron fittings for Thorne's cabin door, refusing payment beyond a promise to bring fresh venison when hunting was good. These people didn't deserve to die because of Thorne's past. The list in the dead man's pocket made it clear that Samuel's murder was part of something larger, something that had tentacles reaching into the present. Someone wanted to clean up loose ends, and that meant eliminating anyone who might remember Samuel's visit to Pine Ridge 10 years ago, anyone who might have heard him talk about what he'd witnessed. Thorne picked up Samuel's photograph again, studying the face he'd tried so hard to forget. His brother had been the better man, kinder, more trusting, more willing to believe in the goodness of others. Those qualities had made him a natural witness against corruption, willing to testify even when it meant leaving everything familiar behind. Samuel had kissed their mother goodbye, shaken Thorne's hand, and promised to return after the trial. Instead, he'd vanished somewhere between Pine Ridge and the territorial capital, taking his testimony and his life with him. Now, a decade later, that decision was bearing bitter fruit. Someone had finally connected Samuel to Pine Ridge, had tracked down his brother, had decided that even the possibility of loose ends was too dangerous to tolerate. The dead man's pack contained enough evidence to suggest this was just the beginning. More would come. better prepared and probably less prone to underestimating a mountain dog's protective instincts. Thorne stood slowly, his joints protesting the mountain cold and the weight of years spent living hard. At 51, he was still strong, still capable, but he felt every one of his winters in moments like this. The easy life he'd built for himself was about to end, and the quiet man who'd chosen peace over justice was going to have to remember how to fight. Jasper watched him with those intelligent eyes, tail wagging slightly, as if sensing his master's resolution. The dog had done his part by exposing the threat. Now it was up to Thorne to decide what came next. He could pack up and disappear deeper into the mountains, abandoning Pine Ridge to whatever fate awaited it. Or he could do what Samuel would have done, stand and fight for the innocent, even if it meant risking everything. As he looked at his brother's photograph one final time before tucking it safely into his shirt pocket, Thorne made his choice. Samuel's death would not be the end of the story. It would be the beginning of something else entirely, a reckoning that was 10 years overdue. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mountain mist and revealing the peaks in sharp detail. Somewhere out there more killers were coming, but they would find Thorne Malloy ready for them, and they would learn that some mountains are more dangerous than they appear. Thorne dragged the body deeper into the trees, where scavengers would handle the disposal nature's way. The man's face meant nothing to him. Lean features weathered by sun and wind, the kind of anonymous competence that spoke of professional violence. No distinguishing marks, no jewelry, nothing that would make him memorable in a crowd. A killer's face, designed to be forgotten. Back at the scattered pack contents, Thorne began his real investigation. Among the maps and weapons, wrapped in oiled leather that had protected it from mountain moisture, he found what changed everything. Pages covered in Samuel's distinctive handwriting, cramped and urgent, as if written in haste or fear. The testimony notes revealed the scope of what his brother had stumbled into. Samuel hadn't just witnessed a murder. He'd uncovered a conspiracy that reached into the territorial government itself. Land speculators working with corrupt officials to claim mineral rights through fraudulent surveys and convenient deaths. Ranchers and miners who refused to sell found themselves facing trumped-up charges or simply disappearing into the vastness of the frontier. The murdered man Samuel had seen killed was a surveyor named Thomas Brennan, shot down in broad daylight for refusing to falsify mineral assessments. The killer had been a territorial marshal named Cord Hutchins, acting on orders from someone Samuel identified only as the Colonel. The conspiracy involved forged documents, bribed officials, and a network of hired guns who eliminated problems with ruthless efficiency. Samuel's notes detailed names, dates and locations. He'd been meticulous in his documentation, gathering evidence the way their father had taught them to gather kindling, methodically, completely, preparing for the fire to come. But somewhere between Pine Ridge and the territorial capital, that fire had consumed Samuel himself. The water-stained pages showed evidence of being hidden, possibly buried, then recovered. Someone had tortured this information out of Samuel before killing him. The handwriting grew shakier toward the end, and dark stains that weren't water marked the final pages. Thorne's hands trembled as he read his brother's last words. "If something happens to me, find Colonel Marcus Steele. He's the one pulling the strings. Don't trust the law. Half of them are on his payroll. Tell Thorne I'm sorry. Tell him to run." But Samuel's final warning came 10 years too late. Thorne had stayed put, and now the reckoning had found him. A torn envelope among the dead man's possessions bore a recent postmark from the territorial capital. Inside, Thorne found instructions written in a careful hand. Malloy knows what his brother learned. Eliminate him and anyone else who might have information. Clean up this loose end permanently. Payment on completion as arranged. The signature was illegible, but the paper was expensive, the kind used by men of importance. Someone with money and influence had waited a decade to tie up the threads of Samuel's murder, patient as a spider in its web. now that patience was paying dividends as they moved to eliminate the final witnesses. Thorne studied the detailed maps of Pine Ridge, noting how thoroughly they'd been prepared. Every building was marked, every trail leading in and out of the valley. Red X marks indicated optimal firing positions. Escape routes were drawn in blue ink. This wasn't the work of a single assassin. This was a military-style operation planned by someone who understood tactics and terrain. More disturbing were the photographs. Sarah McBride hanging laundry outside her store, captured through what must have been a telescopic lens. Tom Fletcher working at his mill, unaware he was being watched. Jake Morrison at his forge, hammering out horseshoes while someone documented his daily routine. They'd been under surveillance for weeks, maybe months. The list of names included details that chilled Thorne to the bone. Next to Sarah's name, 2 children ages 8 and 10, uses children's safety to ensure cooperation. Tom Fletcher's entry noted, war veteran, missing left arm, reduced threat level. Jake Morrison was marked as skilled with weapons, handle with extreme caution. These people had been studied like specimens, their lives reduced to tactical assessments. The clinical precision of it spoke to an organization with resources and reached far beyond what Thorne had imagined. This wasn't frontier justice or even frontier injustice. This was something else entirely, something that treated human lives as bookkeeping entries to be balanced. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. Hidden in the dead man's boot, Thorne found a small leather journal containing names and dates going back 15 years. Samuel's case wasn't unique, it was part of a pattern. Surveyors, miners, ranchers, and their families had been disappearing across 3 territories. Always the same story. They discovered valuable mineral deposits, refused to sell to the right buyers, or threatened to expose corruption. Always the same result, death or disappearance, followed by convenient legal proceedings that transferred their property to shell companies controlled by Colonel Marcus Steele. The journal was a killer's ledger, recording scores of murders with the same detachment a shopkeeper might use to track inventory. Each entry included a name, a location, a date, and a brief note about the method used. Brennan Thomas gunshot daylight, multiple witnesses eliminated, Carver Mary, accident mineshaft, made to look natural. Mitchell family, house fire, no survivors. Property claimed for unpaid taxes. Samuel's name appeared near the end of the list, Malloy. Samuel interrogated, eliminated, body disposed of. Testimony recovered. The casual brutality of it made Thorne's vision blur with rage. His brother had become just another line item in a ledger of systematic murder. The final entries in the journal were dated within the last month. Morrison, Jake, blacksmith, potential witness, eliminate with prejudice. Fletcher, Tom, Miller, questioned by subject's brother, requires attention. McBride, Sarah, store owner, friendly with subject. Children provide leverage. They were all going to die because of him, because he'd chosen to hide in these mountains instead of seeking justice for Samuel, because he'd traded his brother's memory for the illusion of peace. The weight of that realization settled on his shoulders like a physical burden. Jasper whined softly, sensing his master's distress. The dog had been watching the tree line while Thorne read, alert for other threats. That vigilance might be all that stood between Pine Ridge and a massacre. Thorne carefully repacked the evidence, securing it in his own pack. The dead man's weapons, a rifle, a pistol, and a knife designed for quiet killing, went into a separate bundle. If more assassins were coming, these tools might mean the difference between survival and slaughter. As he prepared to leave the clearing, Thorne noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh horse tracks led away from the area, parallel to the trail, but hidden in the trees. The dead man hadn't come alone. Somewhere out there, his partner was waiting, probably wondering why the simple job of killing a mountain hermit was taking so long. The tracks were recent, less than an hour old, and headed toward Pine Ridge. One man to kill Thorne, another to handle the settlement. The plan had been coordinated, professional, designed to eliminate all witnesses in a single sweep. Only Jasper's intervention had disrupted the timeline. Thorne shouldered his pack and started down the mountain, following the horse tracks at a steady lope that ate up ground without exhausting his wind. Jasper ranged ahead, moving through the trees like the half-wild creature he was. They had perhaps an hour's head start if the other killer was proceeding according to the original plan. The evidence in his pack painted a picture of corruption and murder spanning decades. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was reaching Pine Ridge before an innocent community paid the price for his brother's courage. Samuel had died trying to expose the truth. Thorne wouldn't let that sacrifice claim any more lives. As he ran through the forest, dodging low branches and leaping fallen logs, Thorne felt something awakening in him that had been dormant for 10 years. The careful, quiet man who'd chosen isolation over involvement was disappearing, replaced by someone harder and more dangerous. The tactical mind that had kept him alive in the mountains began calculating angles and distances, planning for a confrontation that would determine whether justice or corruption would rule these valleys. Behind him, the dead assassin would feed the ravens. Ahead, his partner was riding toward people who'd never hurt anyone, carrying orders to kill them all. Between them and that fate stood one mountain man, one loyal dog, and the ghost of a brother who died trying to do the right thing. It would have to be enough. The horse tracks led Thorne down the winding mountain trail toward Pine Ridge, but they also led him toward a decision that would change everything. As he followed the clear impressions in the soft earth, he pulled Samuel's compass from his pack, the brass instrument their grandfather had carried during his railroad surveying days, passed down through 3 generations of Malloy men who'd used it to find their way through uncertain terrain. The compass face was scratched and worn, its brass case tarnished by decades of mountain weather, but the needle still pointed true north with unwavering certainty. Samuel had carried it during his final journey, and somehow it had made its way back to the family through channels Thorne could only imagine. Now, as he held it in his palm, the compass seemed to point not just toward magnetic north, but toward the truth Samuel had died protecting. Thorne had always been the practical brother, the one who thought 3 moves ahead, while Samuel charged forward on instinct and righteousness. That caution had kept him alive in the mountains, but it had also kept him from avenging his brother's murder. Now, with innocent lives hanging in the balance, those old instincts were awakening with dangerous clarity. The trail descended through stands of lodgepole pine and aspen, following the natural contours that mountain water had carved over millennia. Thorne moved with the fluid economy of a man who'd spent decades navigating this terrain, placing each step with care while maintaining the steady pace necessary to catch a mounted rider. Jasper ranged ahead, nose to the ground, confirming what the tracks already told them. 1 horse, 1 rider, moving with the confidence of someone who believed his partner had eliminated the primary threat. As they descended, Thorne's tactical mind began working through possibilities. The second assassin would approach Pine Ridge from the north, probably planning to arrive during the busy morning hours when people were moving about their daily business. A stranger wouldn't draw attention immediately. The settlement saw occasional travelers, traders, and drifters passing through. The killer would have time to position himself, to identify his targets, to choose his moment, but he wouldn't expect resistance. The plan had called for Thorne to die first, eliminating the most dangerous opposition before moving against the townspeople. With Thorne presumably dead, the settlement would be helpless, a collection of civilians with no reason to suspect danger until it was too late. That assumption would be the killer's downfall. Thorne knew every trail, every building, every hiding place in Pine Ridge. More importantly, he knew the people, their habits, their strengths, their potential for survival if properly warned and organized. The assassin saw targets marked on a map. Thorne saw a community worth protecting. The compass needle swung as he changed direction, following a shortcut that would bring him to Pine Ridge ahead of the mounted rider. The path was treacherous, a narrow ledge carved into the rock face that dropped away into empty air, but it would save precious minutes. As he edged along the precipice, Thorne found himself thinking about the chess games he'd played with Samuel during their boyhood. Samuel had always been impatient with defensive strategies, preferring bold attacks that sacrificed pieces for quick victories. Thorne had learned to counter that aggression with careful positioning, building walls of pawns and developing his pieces methodically until he could strike with devastating effect. Their father used to say that Samuel played chess like he lived, all heart and no patience. Thorne played like he planned, every move calculated, every sacrifice meaningful. Now, descending toward what might be his final game, Thorne felt those old lessons guiding his thoughts. The assassins had superior numbers, better equipment, and the advantage of planning. But they were playing on his board now, among people he cared about, in terrain he knew better than his own heartbeat. That had to count for something. The shortcut brought him to the ridge overlooking Pine Ridge, just as the morning sun burned the last mist from the valley floor. Below, the settlement spread out like pieces on a chessboard. The general store where Sarah McBride would be opening for business. The mill where Tom Fletcher would be grinding the day's grain. The blacksmith shop where Jake Morrison would already be working his forge. 40 innocent lives going about their morning routines, unaware that death was riding down from the mountains. Thorne studied the approaching trail through eyes trained by years of hunting. The killer would crest the northern ridge in perhaps 20 minutes, giving Thorne a narrow window to reach the settlement and organize some kind of defense. But defense against what? A professional assassin with a plan and the patience to execute it properly could pick off targets one by one, creating terror and confusion while eliminating witnesses systematically. The compass in his hand seemed to pulse with warmth, reminding him of Samuel's final words, "Tell Thorne to run," but running meant abandoning these people to slaughter, and Thorne had already spent 10 years running from the truth of his brother's death. Some debts could only be paid in blood, and some fights couldn't be avoided no matter how far you traveled into the wilderness. Jasper appeared at his side, panting lightly from the descent. The dog's amber eyes held an intelligence that sometimes seemed almost human, and now they seemed to reflect the same grim determination that Thorne felt building in his chest. They'd started this journey as a hermit and his dog. They'd finish it as something else entirely. The trail down to Pine Ridge wound through a series of switchbacks that would bring Thorne to the settlement's edge within 15 minutes if he pushed hard. But speed meant noise, and noise might alert the approaching killer to the change in circumstances. Instead, Thorne chose a slower, quieter approach that would bring him to Jake Morrison's blacksmith shop through the back way. Jake would be the key to organizing any defense. The blacksmith had military experience, steady nerves, and access to weapons. More importantly, he knew the other residents well enough to coordinate their actions without causing panic. If anyone could turn a collection of civilians into an effective fighting force, it would be Jake Morrison. As Thorne made his way down the mountainside, he allowed himself one look back at the compass. The needle pointed steadily north, toward the approaching danger, but also toward the moment when he would finally stop running from Samuel's legacy. His brother had died trying to protect innocent people from corruption and murder. Now it was Thorne's turn to stand between the wolves and the flock. The morning air carried the sounds of a community awakening. The ring of Jake's hammer on anvil, the creak of Tom's mill wheel, the laughter of children playing in the dusty street. Normal sounds of normal lives that would end in blood unless Thorne could find a way to tip the scales in favor of justice. Samuel's compass grew warm in his hand as he descended, toward whatever waited in the valley below. The brass instrument had guided 3 generations of Malloy men through uncertain territory. Now it was guiding Thorne toward the most important navigation of his life, finding the path between survival and honor, between safety and justice. The needle pointed true north, steady as a promise, showing him the way forward into whatever storm was coming. Jake Morrison looked up from his anvil as Thorne materialized from the morning shadows like a ghost given flesh. The blacksmith's hammer froze mid-swing, his weathered face registering surprise at seeing the mountain hermit in town so early. And something else, a recognition of the grim purpose written in Thorne's bearing. "Jake," Thorne said quietly, "ring the bell. 3 long, 2 short. Tell everyone it's a supply meeting at your shop. Don't make it sound urgent, but get them here fast." The settlement's bell hung from a simple wooden frame beside the general store, its bronze voice capable of carrying across the entire valley. Sarah McBride had installed it 5 years ago after her husband's mining accident, recognizing the need for a way to summon help or warn of danger. The townspeople had developed a code, different patterns for different emergencies. 3 long, 2 short meant community meeting, important but not life-threatening. Jake set down his hammer with deliberate care. 20 years of military service had taught him to recognize command authority, and whatever had brought Thorne down from his mountain carried that unmistakable weight. "What kind of trouble are we looking at?" "The kind that kills families in their sleep and calls it business." Thorne pulled the dead assassin's journal from his pack, opening it to the pages that listed Pine Ridge residents. "They've been watching all of you, planning. This isn't random violence, it's systematic elimination." The blacksmith's face hardened as he read the clinical assessments of his neighbors. His missing left arm didn't slow him as he moved to the bell rope, pulling it with measured strokes that sent the bronze voice rolling across the valley. 3 long peals, each sustained and clear, followed by 2 shorter ones. The pattern repeated twice more before Jake returned to where Thorne waited. "How long do we have?" 20 minutes, maybe less. "One man coming down the North Trail, armed and professional. His partner tried to kill me this morning." Thorne gestured toward Jasper, who sat alert beside the forge. "My dog had other ideas." People began emerging from buildings across the settlement, responding to the bell's summons with the unhurried efficiency of a community accustomed to cooperation. Sarah McBride appeared first, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron as she crossed the street. Tom Fletcher followed, his mill wheel stilled, curiosity and concern competing in his expression. Others came in 1s and 2s, the Hendersons from their small farm, old Pete who ran the stable. The Morrison children still young enough to find excitement in any break from routine. Sarah reached the blacksmith shop first, her sharp eyes taking in Thorne's presence and the tension radiating from both men. "What's wrong?" Thorne had never been comfortable with crowds, even friendly ones, but time was running short for gentle explanations. "There's a man coming to kill you all. He's part of an organization that's been murdering people across 3 territories for 15 years. My brother was one of their victims, and now they want to clean up loose ends." The words fell into the morning air, like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and disbelief. Tom Fletcher spoke first, his voice carefully controlled. "Are you certain?" Instead of answering, Thorne handed him the journal, watching the miller's face change as he read the entries documenting systematic murder. Tom's good hand trembled slightly as he passed the book to Sarah, who scanned the pages with growing horror. "My children," she whispered, seeing the notation about using their safety for leverage, "are safe if we handle this right," Thorne said firmly. "Where are they now?" Inside the store, helping with inventory, Sarah's maternal instincts warred with the need for information. "How do we know this is real?" "How do we know you're not?" Jake interrupted her. "Look at his eyes, Sarah. This man's not lying." The blacksmith had seen enough combat to recognize truth delivered under pressure. "What do you need us to do?" Thorne felt a surge of gratitude for Jake's steady acceptance. Military men understood that debate was a luxury that disappeared when lives hung in the balance. "First, get the children and elderly somewhere safe. The old mine shaft behind Pete's stable, it's deep enough to hide sound and has 2 exits if things go wrong." Pete nodded, understanding immediately. The abandoned mine had been the settlement's first attempt at silver extraction, before they'd learned the vein was too small to support commercial operations. Now it would serve as a refuge. "Second," Thorne continued, "we need to control the terrain. The killer will approach from the North Trail, probably planning to scout before making his move. If we can force him into the open before he's ready, we might survive this. Tom Fletcher asked the question that was haunting all of them. What makes you think one man can handle all of us? There are 40 people in this settlement. Thorne's expression darkened. Because he's done it before. The journal documents entire families eliminated by single operatives. These aren't random killers. They're professionals with resources and planning. They study their targets, learn their habits, exploit their weaknesses. Sarah's face had gone pale as she processed the implications. You're talking about someone who murders children. I'm talking about someone who sees your children as leverage to control you, who sees Tom's missing arm as a tactical advantage, who knows exactly how many shells Jake keeps for his hunting rifle. Thorne's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. They've been watching you for weeks, maybe months. They know everything about your routines, your relationships, your vulnerabilities. The group fell silent as the reality of their situation settled over them. These weren't frontier brigands seeking easy money. This was something far more dangerous and systematic. Jake spoke into the silence, his military training asserting itself. What are our assets? Thorne had been cataloguing exactly that during his descent from the mountains. Jake has weapons and military experience. Tom knows machinery and has steady hands despite his injury. Sarah knows everyone's skills and can coordinate communications. Pete knows every trail and hiding place in the valley. The others have various useful skills, but most importantly, they know this terrain better than any outsider. Weapons, Jake asked, limited. Hunting rifles, some pistols, farm tools that could serve in close quarters. Against a professional killer, we'll need to rely more on tactics than firepower. Thorne pulled Samuel's compass from his pocket, its brass surface catching the morning light. But we have one advantage they don't expect, which is, they think I'm dead. Their plan called for eliminating me first, then handling the settlement at leisure. Instead, they're riding into a prepared defense with incomplete intelligence. Thorne's smile held no warmth. My brother always said the best way to win at chess was to make your opponent think they were playing a different game entirely. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from the northern ridge, faint but unmistakable. Time for planning had ended. Time for action had begun. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle. Positions. Thorne looked around at the faces of people who'd chosen to trust him with their lives. Ordinary folks who'd found themselves thrust into extraordinary circumstances, who would either rise to meet the challenge or die trying. The compass in his hand pointed steadily north, toward the approaching danger. Toward the reckoning that had been 10 years in the coming. Remember, he said quietly, we're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for everyone these bastards have killed, and everyone they plan to kill. Make it count. The rider who crested the northern ridge looked nothing like the professional killer Thorne had expected. Middle-aged, soft around the middle, wearing the dusty clothes of a traveling merchant, he guided his horse down the trail with the careful attention of someone unfamiliar with mountain terrain. A leather satchel bounced against his hip, and his movements suggested fatigue rather than predatory alertness. Thorne watched from his concealed position behind the mill, doubt gnawing at his certainty. Had he misread the situation? Were the horse tracks he'd followed from an innocent traveler rather than the second assassin? The possibility that he'd just terrified an entire community based on a mistake made his stomach clench with embarrassment and dread. But Jasper had no such doubts. The dog's hackles rose as the stranger approached, a low growl rumbling in his throat. The same instinctive warning that had saved Thorne's life on the mountain trail was manifesting again. Confirming what logic wanted to dismiss, Jake Morrison had positioned himself at the stable, ostensibly tending to his own horse while maintaining clear sightlines to the settlement's main street. Sarah McBride remained at her store, but Thorne could see her children's faces pressed against the back window. They'd been moved to the rear of the building as planned. Tom Fletcher worked at his mill, the wheel turning slowly, providing natural sound cover for whispered communications. The stranger dismounted near the general store, tying his horse to the hitching post with movements that seemed casual, but which Thorne now recognized as methodical assessment. The man's eyes swept the settlement with practiced efficiency, cataloging positions, counting people, identifying potential threats. His soft appearance was camouflage, as carefully constructed as his merchant's clothing. "Morning," the stranger called to Sarah as she emerged from her store. His voice carried the neutral friendliness of someone accustomed to dealing with strangers. "Wondering if you might have supplies for a traveler heading south." "Been on the trail for days, and my pack's running light." Sarah's response was letter perfect, neither suspicious nor overly helpful. "Certainly. What did you need?" As the stranger began listing mundane items, jerky, hardtack, coffee, Thorne noticed his left hand resting casually near a concealed weapon. The bulge under his coat was subtle, but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. More telling was the way his eyes continued their assessment, while his mouth made pleasant conversation. The man was cataloguing escape routes, counting armed men, identifying the settlement's leadership structure. Every smile, every casual gesture was part of a larger calculation. Thorne had seen the same behavior in territorial marshals and military scouts, the systematic gathering of intelligence disguised as social interaction. "Beautiful country up here," the stranger continued, his gaze sweeping across the surrounding mountains. "Peaceful. Bet a man could disappear into these peaks and never be found." The comment seemed innocent enough, but Thorne caught the subtle threat buried in the words. This was psychological warfare, designed to plant seeds of fear while appearing entirely benign. The killer was establishing dominance through implied violence, letting his targets know they were trapped without stating it directly. Sarah maintained her composure admirably, but Thorne could see the tension in her shoulders. "We like our quiet life. Not much excitement around here." "That's about to change," the stranger said softly, his merchant's mask slipping just enough to reveal something predatory underneath. "I'm looking for a man named Thorne Malloy. Heard he might have passed through here recently." The name hung in the morning air like smoke from a gunshot. Sarah's face remained carefully neutral, but Thorne saw her hand move slightly toward the signal bell rope. The settlement's communication system was about to earn its keep. "Don't recall anyone by that name," Sarah said. "But then we see lots of travelers. They don't always give their real names." The stranger's smile widened, but it never reached his eyes. "Oh, this one would be memorable. Mountain man, keeps to himself, travels with a distinctive dog. Half-wild mutt with wolf in his bloodline." The description was too accurate to be coincidental. "He's wanted for questioning in connection with some unfortunate business down south." Thorne felt ice forming in his veins. The killer knew about Jasper, knew enough details to have been briefed by his dead partner, which meant he also knew his partner hadn't returned from the morning's work. The pleasant conversation was reconnaissance disguised as misdirection. Jake Morrison emerged from the stable, leading his horse toward the water trough. His positioning was casual but deliberate, placing him within 30 feet of the stranger, with clear sight lines. Tom Fletcher continued working at his mill, but his movements had gained purpose, hands moving toward tools that could double as weapons. The stranger noticed these shifts with professional awareness. "Seems like a busy morning for such a quiet place." "Everyone's got somewhere to be. Work doesn't stop for conversation," Jake said evenly. "But you're welcome to water your horse if needed." "Appreciate the hospitality." The stranger's hand drifted closer to his concealed weapon. "Though I'm curious about something. See, I was supposed to meet my partner here this morning. He was handling some business up in the mountains, said he'd catch up before noon." The admission confirmed Thorne's suspicions while revealing the killer's strategy. He was probing for information about his partner's fate while maintaining the pretense of innocent inquiry. If the townspeople knew nothing, they'd react with genuine confusion. If they were involved, their responses would betray knowledge they shouldn't possess. Sarah played her role perfectly. "Sorry, haven't seen anyone else today. Just you. That's strange." The stranger's voice carried manufactured concern. "He's usually punctual. Wonder if he ran into trouble on the mountain trails. Dangerous country up there for a man traveling alone." The implied threat was becoming more explicit. Soon the killer would abandon subtlety for direct action, and when that happened, people would start dying. Thorne needed to act before the situation deteriorated further, but premature exposure would waste their carefully prepared positions. Jasper made the decision for him. The dog emerged from behind the mill, moving with purposeful intent toward the stranger. Not attacking, not yet, but positioning himself between the killer and the civilian population with unmistakable protective instinct. The stranger's eyes locked onto Jasper immediately, recognition flashing across his features. Well now, that's an interesting dog. Looks like he might have some wolf in him. The game was over. Masks were coming off. The killer's hand moved toward his weapon with professional smoothness, but Jake Morrison was already in motion, military reflexes overriding civilian caution. "Down!" Jake shouted, diving toward cover as his warning echoed across the settlement. The morning erupted into violence as carefully laid plans collided with desperate improvisation. The stranger's gun cleared its holster with practiced efficiency, but Thorne was already moving, using the mill's bulk as cover while closing the distance between predator and prey. Samuel's compass grew warm in his pocket as the reckoning began. The stranger's first shot shattered, the morning calm like thunder splitting a clear sky. Jake Morrison dove behind a water trough as the bullet sparked off the iron rim where his head had been moments before. The killer's merchant disguise fell away completely as he moved with the fluid efficiency of a professional. Seeking cover while assessing targets with cold calculation, Thorne burst from behind the mill, closing the distance in a sprint that covered 20 yards before the assassin could bring his weapon to bear. But the killer was already moving, using his horse as a shield while working the lever of his rifle with practiced speed. The animal screamed and reared as gunfire erupted around it, adding chaos to an already desperate situation. "Sarah, get down!" Tom Fletcher shouted from his mill, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of splintering wood as bullets punched through the building's walls. The killer was firing systematically, not at specific targets but to create panic and confusion while he repositioned for better shots. Thorne reached the general store's corner as another shot whined past his ear, close enough to feel the bullet's passage. The assassin had taken position behind a supply wagon, using its bulk to shield his movements while maintaining clear lines of fire across the settlement's main street. Professional positioning that turned the town's open design into a killing ground. Jake Morrison rolled from behind the water trough, his hunting rifle speaking once with authority. The shot struck the wagon's wooden side, spraying splinters but missing the killer who'd anticipated the angle and adjusted accordingly. Jake worked his bolt action smoothly, chambering another round while seeking better cover. "He's got us pinned," Jake called. "Can't get a clean shot from here." The settlement's layout, designed for peaceful commerce rather than warfare, provided limited defensive positions. Buildings were spaced for easy access and natural light, creating open areas that favored an attacker with superior firepower. The killer was using this to his advantage, controlling the center while forcing defenders into disadvantageous positions. Thorne studied the situation with tactical eyes, his mind automatically calculating angles and distances. The assassin had chosen his position well, protected from 3 sides, with clear sightlines to every major building. But he'd also trapped himself in a static position, and static positions could be flanked by someone willing to take risks. "Tom, keep him busy," Thorne called. "Don't expose yourself, just make noise." The miller understood immediately, using tools and machinery to create the sounds of movement while staying safely behind stone walls. His mill wheel creaked and groaned as he worked the mechanisms, metal striking metal in irregular patterns that suggested multiple defenders repositioning. Meanwhile, Thorne began working his way around the settlement's perimeter, using buildings and terrain features to mask his movement. The killer's attention was focused on the obvious threats: Jake's rifle, Tom's mill, Sarah's store where the children waited. He wasn't watching for a flanking maneuver through the settlement's back alleys. Jasper appeared at Thorne's side, moving with the silent efficiency of his wolf ancestors. The dog understood pack tactics instinctively, positioning himself to support his human strategy while remaining ready to exploit any opening. Together, they moved through shadows and dead ground, circling toward the killer's exposed flank. Sarah McBride crouched behind her store's counter, her children pressed against the floor behind her. She could hear the gunfire outside, could smell the acrid smoke of black powder drifting through her open door. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to grab her children and flee into the mountains. But Tom's mill lay between her store and the safe trails, and the killer commanded the space between. "Mama," her youngest whispered, "what's happening?" "Bad men came to hurt us," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "But Mr. Morrison and the others are protecting us. We just need to stay down and be brave." Another shot rang out, followed by the sound of breaking glass as a bullet found one of her store windows. The killer was methodically destroying anything that might provide cover, whittling away the defender's options while conserving ammunition for precise shots. Jake Morrison recognized the strategy and adjusted accordingly. Instead of trying to match the assassin shot for shot, he began using the environment itself as a weapon. His rifle spoke once, the bullet striking not at the killer but at the wagon wheel supporting his cover. Wood splintered and iron bent as the heavy wagon lurched sideways, forcing the assassin to scramble for new protection. "Good shot," Tom called from his mill. "Keep him moving." But the killer adapted with professional smoothness, abandoning the damaged wagon for position behind a stone watering trough that provided better protection. His return fire was immediate and accurate, forcing Jake to duck as bullets chipped stone from the stable wall behind him. Thorne reached his flanking position just as the assassin settled into his new cover. The killer's back was exposed for perhaps 3 seconds as he adjusted his rifle rest, and Thorne took the shot without hesitation. The bullet struck the stone trough inches from the assassin's shoulder, sending rock fragments flying but missing flesh by the narrowest margin. The killer spun toward this new threat, his rifle tracking with mechanical precision. But Thorne was already moving, using momentum and terrain to stay ahead of the weapon's arc. Jasper darted in from the opposite side, not attacking but creating another distraction that forced the assassin to divide his attention. "Two can play flanking games," the killer called, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd survived similar situations. He fired twice in rapid succession, once at Thorne's last position, once at the dog, before rolling sideways to avoid return fire. The rolling movement brought him directly into Jake Morrison's line of sight. The blacksmith's rifle cracked once, the sound sharp and final in the morning air. The killer jerked backward, his own weapon flying from suddenly nerveless fingers as Jake's bullet found its mark. But the man wasn't finished. Even wounded, he reached for a concealed pistol with his offhand, his movements driven by professional determination rather than hope. Thorne closed the remaining distance in 3 long strides, tackling the assassin before the backup weapon could clear its holster. They rolled across the dusty ground, fighting for control of the pistol, while Jake worked his bolt action for a finishing shot he couldn't take without risking Thorne's life. The killer was wounded but far from helpless. Using techniques that spoke of extensive training in close-quarters combat, Jasper ended the struggle with simple efficiency, his jaws closing on the assassin's gun hand with the crushing force of his wolf heritage. The pistol fell forgotten as the killer screamed, his professional composure finally breaking under the reality of tooth and claw. Thorne rolled clear, breathing hard as Jake approached with his rifle ready. The fight was over, but the victory felt hollow. They defeated 1 killer, but the journal in Thorne's pack suggested many more existed. Part of an organization that had operated with impunity for 15 years, the morning sun climbed higher, burning off the gun smoke and illuminating a settlement forever changed by violence. In the distance, church bells were ringing, not the settlement's signal bell, but something else entirely, something that suggested their troubles were far from over. The wounded assassin lay propped against the stone watering trough, his face pale from blood loss, but his eyes still calculating. Jake kept his rifle trained on the man while Thorne searched him for additional weapons, finding a knife, another pistol, and a leather portfolio that felt heavy with documents. "You killed my partner," the assassin said, his voice steady despite his wounds. "That wasn't supposed to happen." "Your partner tried to kill me first," Thorne replied, opening the portfolio. Seemed like a reasonable response. The documents inside made Thorne's blood run cold. Maps of the entire territory, marked with red X's indicating completed operations. Lists of names spanning 3 states, with neat check marks beside those who'd been eliminated. Financial records showing payments from shell companies controlled by territorial officials. And at the bottom of the stack, a document that changed everything. "Well now," the assassin said, watching Thorne's face as he read. "Found something interesting, did you?" The paper was an official territorial warrant, signed by Judge Marcus Whitman and countersigned by Marshal Cord Hutchins, the same Marshal Samuel had identified as Thomas Brennan's killer. But the warrant wasn't for Thorne's arrest. It was for his protection, issued just 3 days ago and stamped with the territorial seal. "I don't understand," Sarah said, reading over Thorne's shoulder. "It says you're under territorial protection, that they're supposed to keep you safe." The assassin's laugh was bitter. "Tell her the rest, Malloy. Tell her who signed the protection order." Thorne's eyes found the signature at the bottom of the document, and his world tilted on its axis. Judge Samuel Malloy, written in the careful script he remembered from childhood letters. His brother's name, his brother's handwriting, on a document dated 3 days ago. "That's impossible," Thorne whispered. "Samuel's been dead for 10 years, has he?" The assassin's smile was cruel. "Or has he been hiding in plain sight, building a new identity while you grieved for a ghost?" Jake Morrison stepped closer, his rifle never wavering. "What's he talking about?" Thorne's hands shook as he examined the signature more closely. The loops and curves were identical to the testimony notes he'd found in the dead assassin's pack. The same handwriting that had documented corruption and murder. The same careful script that had begged for justice. "The man who hired us to kill you isn't Colonel Marcus Steele," the assassin continued, enjoying Thorne's confusion. "It's your brother, Judge Samuel Malloy of the Territorial Court. The same man whose testimony put half our organization behind bars 15 years ago." The words hit Thorne like physical blows. Everything he'd believed about Samuel's death, everything he'd built his grief upon, was crumbling around him. "You're lying, am I?" The assassin reached into his coat with careful movements, producing a small daguerreotype that he tossed at Thorne's feet. "Recent picture, taken last month at the territorial capital." The photograph showed a man in judge's robes standing beside the territorial courthouse. Older, graying at the temples, wearing spectacles that hadn't been necessary in his youth, but unmistakably Samuel Malloy. The same face that had haunted Thorne's dreams for a decade, aged by time but very much alive. "The protection warrant was his idea," the assassin explained. "Keep you safe while he cleaned up the last of Steele's organization. But some of us had other ideas about family loyalty." Sarah McBride stared at the photograph, then at Thorne's stricken face. "Your brother's alive, but the body, the testimony notes, all theater," the assassin said. "Samuel Malloy needed to disappear to infiltrate Steele's organization. Faking his death was the only way to do it safely. He spent 10 years working his way up through the territorial government, gathering evidence, building cases. Very patient man, your brother." Thorne's mind reeled as implications cascaded through his consciousness. If Samuel was alive, if he'd been working undercover for a decade, then everything Thorne had believed was wrong. The grief, the isolation, the years of self-imposed exile, all based on a lie designed to protect him. "But the killers," Tom Fletcher said, his analytical mind trying to make sense of the revelation. "If Samuel's on our side, why are people trying to kill us?" "Because not everyone in the organization got the memo," the assassin replied. "Samuel may think he's in control, but Marcus Steele still has loyalists, men who'd rather see the whole thing burn than let a Malloy bring them down." Jake Morrison had been listening with growing anger. "So you're telling us this has all been some kind of family feud? People have died because two brothers couldn't figure out how to talk to each other. People have died because corruption runs deep and justice comes hard, the assassin corrected. Samuel Malloy chose the long game over quick satisfaction. Whether that was wise, he shrugged. I suppose we'll find out. Thorne stared at the photograph until the image blurred. His brother alive after all these years, working in secret to bring down the very organization Thorne had thought had killed him. The irony was almost too bitter to bear. Where is he? Thorne asked quietly. Territorial capital. Probably wondering why his protection detail missed their check-in. The assassin's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. You killed 2 of his men this morning. I wonder how he'll take that news. A new sound reached them from the valley, the distant thunder of multiple horses moving at speed. Thorne counted at least 6 riders, maybe more, approaching from the south. Too many to be coincidence, too organized to be random travelers, more of Steele's men? Jake asked. The assassin shook his head. Territorial marshals, Samuel's people coming to clean up this mess. His smile turned predatory. Question is, are they here to rescue you or arrest you? Hard to tell with the Malloy family. Thorne felt the weight of Samuel's compass in his pocket, the brass instrument that had guided him down from the mountains and into this moment of terrible revelation. For 10 years, he'd thought he was following his brother's final wishes. Instead, he'd been running from a truth that Samuel had been trying to protect him from discovering. Why? Thorne asked, his voice barely audible. Why let me think he was dead? Because you would have tried to help, the assassin said simply, and gotten yourself killed in the process. Samuel knew you well enough to know you'd never stay hidden if you thought he was in danger. Better to let you grieve than let you die. The approaching riders were close enough now that individual horses could be distinguished. 6 men in territorial marshal uniforms, riding hard and armed for serious trouble. At their head rode a figure that even at distance looked familiar, tall in the saddle, sitting his horse with the easy grace Thorne remembered from their youth. That would be your brother now, the assassin observed. Bit dramatic, isn't he? Always did have a flair for timing. Sarah touched Thorne's arm gently. What are you going to do? Thorne looked around at the people who'd risked their lives based on his word, who'd fought alongside him against killers because they'd trusted his judgment. Now that trust had led them into the middle of a conspiracy that stretched back 15 years, with his supposedly dead brother at the center of it all. I'm going to get some answers, Thorne said, his voice carrying the steel that had sustained him through a decade of mountain winters. And Samuel's going to give them to me, whether he wants to or not. The riders crested the ridge, and Thorne could see his brother's face clearly for the first time in 10 years. Samuel looked older, careworn, but very much alive. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment, both brothers knew that the reckoning they'd avoided for a decade was finally at hand. Samuel raised his hand, signaling his men to slow their approach. The gesture was cautious, respectful, the movement of someone who understood he was entering a volatile situation where the wrong word could spark violence. Thorne touched his brother's compass one final time. Feeling its steady weight, the needle had always pointed true north, but truth itself was proving more complicated than magnetic attraction. Soon, very soon, he would learn whether a decade of separation had destroyed the bond between them, or merely tested it in ways they'd never imagined. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across Pine Ridge, as 2 brothers prepared to bridge 10 years of lies with whatever honesty remained between them. Samuel Malloy dismounted 50 yards from the settlement's edge, his territorial marshal's badge catching the morning sun like a beacon of authority. Even from that distance, Thorne could see the weight his brother carried. Not just the physical bulk of 10 additional years, but the accumulated burden of a decade spent living among killers and corrupt officials. That's far enough, Thorne called, his voice carrying clearly across the dusty ground between them. Samuel's men remained mounted, hands resting near their weapons with the easy alertness of professionals who understood that family reunions could turn deadly without warning. Samuel raised both hands in a gesture of peace, but his eyes never left Thorne's face. We need to talk, brother. Apparently, we do. Thorne stepped into the open street, leaving cover but maintaining distance. Since you forgot to mention being alive for the past 10 years, the wounded assassin laughed weakly from his position against the watering trough. This should be entertaining. $20 says they start shooting at each other before they start hugging. Jake Morrison silenced him with a look that promised violence if he spoke again. The blacksmith kept his rifle ready, unsure whether the new arrivals represented rescue or additional threat. The afternoon's revelations had shattered everyone's assumptions about who could be trusted. The deception was necessary, Samuel said, taking a careful step forward. If you'd known the truth, you would have tried to help and gotten yourself killed. Instead, I spent 10 years thinking you were dead. 10 years blaming myself for not going with you, not protecting you. Thorne's voice carried the accumulated pain of a decade's worth of grief. Was that easier on your conscience? Samuel's composure cracked slightly. Every day, every single day I wanted to send word to let you know. But Marcus Steele had informants everywhere. One wrong move and we'd both be dead. So you let me bury an empty coffin and carve your name on a headstone. The bitterness in Thorne's voice was sharp enough to cut. Very thoughtful. The body wasn't empty. Samuel's words fell into the space between them like stones into still water. Do you remember Thomas Brennan? The surveyor whose murder I witnessed? Thorne nodded, his throat tight. Brennan was the man whose death had started everything, the killing that had driven Samuel to seek justice through the territorial courts. Brennan was about my height, my build. When Steele's men caught up with us on the trail to the capital, they killed him, thinking he was me. By the time they realized their mistake, we were already staging the scene to make it look like Samuel Malloy had died. Brennan got the burial he deserved, and I got the cover I needed to disappear. The explanation made tactical sense, but it did nothing to ease the ache in Thorne's chest. You could have trusted me with the truth, could I? Samuel's voice carried a challenge. Could I have told you I was going undercover with killers and corruption, that I might be gone for years, that you couldn't contact me or know if I was alive? Would you have let me go alone? The honest answer was no, and they both knew it. Thorne would have insisted on helping, on sharing the danger, on standing beside his brother against whatever came. That impulse would have gotten them both killed before the first week was out. Judge Whitman was the key, Samuel continued, explaining the chess game he'd been playing for a decade. He'd been fighting Steele's organization from within the territorial government, but he needed someone on the inside. Someone Steele would trust because they had reason to hate the law. So you became the grieving brother seeking revenge, Thorne said. Understanding the role Samuel had constructed for himself. It took 3 years to get close to Steele's inner circle. 3 years of doing things that kept me awake at night, of building a reputation as someone who'd turned against everything I'd once believed in. Samuel's voice carried the weight of compromises that had cost him pieces of his soul. But it worked. Eventually, I had access to their records, their plans, their entire network. Sarah McBride had been listening with growing understanding. That's how you became a territorial judge. You weren't appointed through normal channels. Judge Whitman sponsored my appointment once I'd gathered enough evidence to start dismantling the conspiracy from within. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Samuel Malloy, thought dead for his principles, returning to enforce the very laws he'd supposedly died defending. Tom Fletcher spoke from his position at the mill. How many people have died while you played this long game? The question hit Samuel like a physical blow. Too many. Every name in that ledger represents someone I failed to save, someone who died while I gathered evidence instead of acting. His voice dropped to a whisper. The weight of those deaths is mine to carry. One of Samuel's marshals rode closer, his expression urgent. Judge, we need to move. Steele's men will be regrouping, and staying in one place makes us vulnerable. Samuel nodded, but didn't take his eyes off Thorne. Marcus Steele escaped federal custody 3 days ago, killed 2 guards and disappeared into the territory with a dozen loyal men. He knows the game is over, knows his organization is finished. Now he's just trying to take as many people with him as possible, starting with the witnesses who can testify against him, Thorne said. understanding flooding through him, starting with my brother, who represents everything he's spent 15 years trying to destroy. Samuel's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon. He's coming here, Thorne. Probably already on his way. This settlement, these people, they're just bait to draw you into the open. The captured assassin stirred against the watering trough. Steele's got 20 men, maybe more. Veterans, all of them. You can't fight that many with farmers and shopkeepers. Jake Morrison's jaw tightened. Watch us try. No. Samuel's voice carried absolute authority. We evacuate everyone. Move them to the territorial capital where they'll be safe. Then we end this, and let Steele burn Pine Ridge to the ground? Sarah asked. This is our home. These are our lives. Lives that won't mean much if you're dead, one of Samuel's marshals pointed out. Thorne looked around at the faces of people who'd fought beside him, who'd trusted him with their safety, who'd chosen to stand rather than run when killers came calling. The thought of abandoning their homes, their community, everything they'd built, sat in his stomach like a stone. There's another option, he said quietly. Samuel read his brother's expression and shook his head. No, whatever you're thinking, the answer is no. Steele wants me. Fine, he can have me. But not here, not where innocent people will get caught in the crossfire. Thorne pulled Samuel's compass from his pocket, studying its face in the afternoon light. There's a box canyon about 5 miles north. Granite walls, single entrance. Perfect place for a final accounting. It's also a perfect place to get yourself killed. Samuel pointed out, maybe. Or maybe it's a perfect place to make Steele pay for 15 years of murder and corruption. Thorne looked at his brother with eyes that had seen too much violence and carried too much grief. Either way, it ends there. No more innocent people die because of our family's choices. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his tactical mind working through possibilities and probabilities. Even if we could lure Steele to the canyon, 20 armed men against the 2 of us isn't favorable odds. Who said anything about just the 2 of us? Jake Morrison stepped forward, his rifle cradled in his arms. Some fights are worth having, even when the odds are bad. Tom Fletcher nodded agreement. These people killed your brother, or tried to. They've been murdering families for 15 years. That stops today. Sarah looked at her children, then at the men planning to ride toward almost certain death. The women and children evacuate to safety. The men who want to fight can make their own choices. This isn't your fight, Thorne protested. Like hell it isn't, Jake replied. They came to our town, threatened our families, tried to turn our home into a killing ground. That makes it our fight. Samuel studied the determined faces around him, seeing the same quality that had drawn him to testify against corruption all those years ago. Steele will expect an ambush. He's not stupid, no, Thorne agreed, but he's angry. And angry men make mistakes. He looked at the compass in his hand, then at his brother. Besides, we won't be ambushing him. We'll be waiting for him, like a formal appointment. The wounded assassin laughed despite his pain. You're all insane. Steele's killed territorial marshals, federal agents, entire families. What makes you think a handful of mountain folk can stop him? Thorne tucked the compass back into his pocket, feeling its familiar weight. Because we're not trying to arrest him or reason with him. We're just trying to kill him. He looked at Samuel. And we've got advantages he doesn't expect, such as, we know the ground. We know each other, and we know exactly what we're fighting for. Thorne gestured toward the settlement, toward the people who'd risked everything based on his word. Sometimes that's enough. Samuel was quiet for another long moment, then nodded slowly. Box Canyon it is. But we do this smart. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. We go in with a plan, and we stick to it. Agreed. Thorne extended his hand to his brother, the first physical contact they'd had in 10 years. Partners? Samuel clasped the offered hand, feeling the calluses and scars of a decade spent living hard in the mountains. Partners. Like old times. Better than old times, Thorne replied. This time we finish what we started. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Soon, darkness would provide cover for movement, for positioning, for the final game that would end with justice or death. Either way, the waiting was almost over. The box canyon waited like an open grave, carved from granite and time. Thorne crouched behind a boulder formation at the canyon's mouth, Samuel's compass steady in his palm as the final pieces of their trap fell into place. The narrow entrance funneled all approaches into a killing field, carefully prepared over the past 4 hours. But success would depend on timing, discipline, and more luck than any reasonable man should expect. Samuel lay prone on the canyon's eastern rim, his rifle trained on the approach trail. 3 of his territorial marshals occupied positions along the western wall, their weapons sighted on overlapping fields of fire. Jake Morrison had taken the most dangerous position, hidden among the rocks at the canyon's back wall, ready to prevent any escape once the shooting started. Tom Fletcher remained in Pine Ridge with the women and children, his mill serving as a fortress while the real battle unfolded 5 miles away. The one-armed veteran had wanted to fight, but someone needed to coordinate the evacuation if their gamble failed catastrophically. Movement on the North Trail, Samuel's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air. 20 riders, moving in tactical formation. Thorne felt his heart settle into the steady rhythm that preceded violence. Marcus Steele had taken the bait, responding to their deliberately obvious tracks with the confidence of a predator who'd never encountered effective resistance. But confidence could become overconfidence, and overconfident men made fatal mistakes. "Remember the plan," Thorne called softly. "Let them get fully committed before anyone opens fire. We get one chance to even the odds." The sound of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls, multiplied and distorted until it seemed like an army was descending upon them. Steele's voice carried over the hoofbeats, directing his men with the casual authority of someone accustomed to overwhelming opposition through superior numbers. "Spread out in a line. Watch for crossfire positions. Malloy's up there somewhere, probably thinking he's clever." 20 armed men entered the canyon in a disciplined formation that spoke of military training and combat experience. They moved with the easy competence of professionals who'd fought together before, weapons ready but not panicked. These weren't territorial thugs or hired killers, they were the core of Steele's organization, the survivors who'd kept the conspiracy alive for 15 years. Marcus Steele himself rode at the center of the formation. A man in his 50s, with the bearing of someone who'd commanded respect through fear for most of his adult life. Gray-haired and lean, he sat his horse with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight that mattered. His eyes swept the canyon walls methodically, cataloging potential threats while maintaining the aggressive posture that had intimidated opponents for decades. "Thorne Malloy." Steele's voice boomed off the granite walls. "I know you're up there. Come down and we'll make this quick." Thorne remained hidden, watching as the riders spread across the canyon floor. His brother's plan was working. Steele's men were positioning themselves exactly where the crossfire would be most effective. But the moment required patience, the same quality that had kept Thorne alive during 10 years of mountain winters. "Your brother thought he was smart too," Steele continued, his horse dancing sideways as he scanned the rimrock. "Spent 10 years playing judge and marshal, thinking he could bring me down from the inside. All he did was give me time to identify every witness, every piece of evidence, every loose end that needed cutting. The taunt was designed to provoke premature action, but Thorne had learned patience in a hard school. He watched as the last of Steele's men entered the canyon, their escape route now blocked by geography and planning. "Samuel Malloy was always too righteous for his own good," Steele called. "Believed in justice and law like they were articles of faith. That kind of thinking gets men killed in the real world." Samuel's rifle spoke once, from the eastern rim, the shot echoing like thunder in the confined space. Steele's horse screamed and went down, pinning its rider briefly beneath its thrashing bulk. The disciplined formation dissolved into chaos as 20 men tried to identify threats that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Now," Thorne shouted, rising from cover with his rifle already tracking targets. The canyon erupted in gunfire as carefully positioned defenders opened up on the trapped riders. Men who'd survived decades of frontier violence found themselves caught in a killing field with nowhere to run and limited cover. Horses screamed and reared as bullets filled the air, adding to the confusion while their riders fought to maintain control. Marcus Steele rolled clear of his fallen mount, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, but his eyes still calculating. Even trapped and outgunned, he was directing his men with hand signals, trying to organize a defense from impossible circumstances. "The rim!" one of his men shouted. "They're on the rim!" Bullets began chipping rock around Samuel's position as Steele's survivors identified the source of the devastating fire. The territorial marshals returned fire from their concealed positions, but the advantage of surprise was already beginning to fade. Thorne worked his rifle with mechanical precision, each shot carefully aimed and deliberately paced. This wasn't about heroics or dramatic gestures, it was about reducing the enemy's numbers before they could organize an effective response. The compass in his pocket seemed to pulse with warmth as the battle raged around him, pointing not toward magnetic north but toward justice long-delayed Marcus. Steele's tactical mind was still working despite the blood, running down his face and the bodies of his men scattered across the canyon floor. He'd lost half his force in the opening volleys, but the survivors were finding cover among the fallen rocks and returning disciplined fire that was beginning to pin down the defenders. "Concentrate on the eastern rim," Steele barked, his voice carrying clearly over the gunfire. "That's where their leader is positioned." Bullets began spanging off the granite around Samuel's position with increasing accuracy. The territorial marshals were good shots, but Steele's remaining men were professionals who'd survived 15 years of frontier warfare. They were adapting to the ambush with deadly efficiency. Thorne saw his brother forced to abandon his carefully chosen position as rifle fire chewed chunks from the rocks around him. The advantage of surprise was gone, and now it came down to superior numbers against superior positioning, a calculation that didn't favor the defenders if the fight dragged on. "Jake," Thorne called toward the canyon's back wall. "Now would be good." The blacksmith rose from concealment with a stick of mining dynamite in his good hand, the fuse already burning. His throw was perfect, the explosive landing among Steele's men with devastating timing. The blast echoed like thunder between the canyon walls, sending men and horses flying in a cloud of dust and smoke. When the debris settled, only 6 of Steele's men remained in fighting condition. But Marcus Steele himself was still alive, still dangerous, still directing his surviving forces with the cold competence that had made him untouchable for a decade and a half. "Close quarters," Steele ordered his men. "Get up those walls and finish this." The survivors began scrambling up the canyon's rocky slopes, using cracks and ledges to climb toward the defenders' positions. It was a desperate gambit, but desperation could be its own advantage when wielded by men with nothing left to lose. Thorne abandoned his rifle for the pistol at his hip as one of Steele's climbers reached his level. The man was young, quick, and utterly ruthless, the kind of killer the conspiracy had been recruiting for years. They grappled among the rocks, fighting for position while trying to bring weapons to bear. The killer was strong and experienced, but Thorne had spent 10 years surviving in country that killed the unwary. Mountain life had honed him to a weapon's edge, and when the moment came, he was ready for it. The man's knife scraped across Thorne's ribs as Samuel's compass fell from his pocket, the brass instrument bouncing off the rocks toward the canyon floor. Thorne's answering thrust found its mark between the killer's ribs, ending the fight with brutal efficiency. But there was no time to savor victory. More men were climbing, and the sound of gunfire from other positions suggested his allies were facing similar close-quarters battles. Samuel had descended from the eastern rim and was moving across the canyon floor with his rifle, hunting Marcus Steele among the smoke and confusion. The 2 men, who'd orchestrated 15 years of conspiracy and resistance, were finally approaching their reckoning. Steele emerged from behind a fallen boulder with a pistol in each hand, his face a mask of blood and determination. Samuel Malloy, the righteous brother who thought he could play both sides. "The game's over, Marcus." Samuel's rifle was trained on Steele's chest. "Your organization is finished. Your men are dead. Surrender and you'll live to see trial." Steele's laugh was bitter. "Trial? By judges you've bought or intimidated?" "I think not." His pistols came up with professional speed, but Samuel was already moving, using his rifle like a club to knock one weapon aside while diving for cover. They rolled across the rocky ground, fighting for control of the remaining pistol, while debris from Jake's explosion continued to rain down around them. 15 years of conflict compressed into a few seconds of desperate violence between two men who'd shaped each other's destinies without ever meeting face to face. Thorne scrambled down the canyon wall toward the struggle, but other hands were faster. Jasper appeared from nowhere, the half-wild dog launching himself at Steele with the savage efficiency of his wolf heritage. The impact broke Steele's grip on his weapon and sent both men sprawling. Samuel rolled clear and came up with the pistol, its barrel centered on Marcus Steele's chest. For a moment, the canyon fell silent, except for the echoes of gunfire fading among the granite walls. "It's finished," Samuel said quietly. Steele looked around at the bodies of his men, at the defenders emerging from their positions, at the end of everything he'd built over a decade and a half of systematic murder. "You think this changes anything?" "There are others. The corruption goes deeper than one organization." "Maybe," Samuel replied. "But your part in it ends here." The shot echoed once through the canyon, then silence settled over the killing ground like a shroud. Marcus Steele lay still among the rocks, his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky he'd used to guide so many other men to their deaths. Thorne retrieved Samuel's compass from where it had fallen, the brass surface scratched, but the needle still pointing true north. The instrument had guided him through the wilderness and into this moment of reckoning. Now it would guide him home. 3 months later, Thorne sat on the porch of his rebuilt cabin, watching autumn paint the Windcliffs in shades of gold and crimson. The chess set rested on the table between two chairs, both occupied now for the first time in over a decade. Samuel studied the board with the same intense concentration he'd shown as a boy, considering his next move with judicial care. The cabin itself had been expanded during the late summer, gaining a second bedroom and a larger common area suitable for visitors. Samuel's territorial duties kept him traveling, but he spent what time he could in the mountains, rebuilding the relationship that had been fractured by necessity and maintained by hope. "Your move," Thorne said, settling back in his chair with a cup of coffee that steamed in the cool morning air. Samuel advanced a pawn, then looked up at his brother. "The federal prosecutors finished their review yesterday. Steele's organization is officially dismantled. 23 indictments, including 6 territorial officials and 2 federal marshals." "Justice," Thorne said, though the word felt insufficient for 15 years of systematic murder. "Samuel would have been proud." "Samuel is proud," his brother corrected gently. "Just took him longer to get there than anyone expected." The joke was an old one now, born from the surreal experience of grieving for someone who turned out to be alive. They'd worked through most of the anger and confusion in long conversations during Samuel's visits, but some wounds healed slowly. Trust, once broken by necessity, required patience to rebuild. Jasper lay stretched across the porch, his graying muzzle resting on his paws as he dozed in the afternoon sun. The dog had earned a hero's retirement after his role in exposing the conspiracy, though he seemed to prefer the quiet routine of mountain life to any recognition human society might offer. "How's Pine Ridge?" Samuel asked, moving a knight to support his advanced pawn. "Thriving." Thorne captured the pawn with his bishop, maintaining pressure on Samuel's position. "Sarah's store is busier than ever since the territorial governor declared the valley safe for settlement. Tom's talking about expanding his mill. Jake's training 2 apprentices to handle the increased demand for his services. The settlement had indeed prospered in the months following Steele's death. Word had spread that the corruption plaguing the territory was finally broken, drawing new families seeking honest opportunities in clean country. Pine Ridge had grown from 40 souls to nearly 100, with more arriving each week. "And you?" Samuel studied the board, but his attention was clearly on his brother's answer. Any thoughts about rejoining civilization? Thorne considered the question while Samuel pondered his next move. The isolation that had sustained him for a decade felt different now, chosen rather than imposed, peaceful rather than lonely. He still preferred the mountains to towns, still found solace in the rhythm of seasons and weather, but the bitter edge of self-imposed exile had faded. "I'm civilized enough," he said finally. "Besides, someone needs to keep an eye on things up here. Make sure the next group of killers finds a less hospitable reception." Samuel smiled at that, recognizing the stubborn independence that had defined his brother since childhood. "Fair enough. Though you might consider taking on a deputy. Word is there's a young marshal looking for assignment in quiet country." "Quiet country?" Thorne laughed. "After what happened here?" "Precisely because of what happened here. Nothing says don't start trouble like a graveyard full of professional killers." Samuel moved his queen, threatening Thorne's king and forcing a defensive response. "Besides, the territorial government wants someone reliable watching the northern passes. Someone who knows the country and can handle whatever comes down those trails." The offer was attractive in ways Thorne hadn't expected. Not the badge or the official authority, but the chance to prevent others from experiencing what his family had endured. To stand between innocent people and the kind of systematic evil that had plagued the territory for so long. "I'll think about it," he said, moving his king to safety. Samuel nodded, understanding that with his brother, "I'll think about it" was practically an acceptance. No rush. "The position will be there when you're ready." They played in comfortable silence for a while, the board reflecting the same pattern their relationship had always followed. Samuel aggressive and forward-thinking, Thorne careful and defensive. But experience had taught them both the value of patience, of building positions carefully rather than rushing toward quick victories. "Check," Samuel said quietly, his rook sliding across the board to threaten Thorne's king. Thorne studied the position, then smiled. "Checkmate in 3 moves." "What?" Samuel leaned forward, recalculating the board position with sudden intensity. Thorne moved his knight, the piece sliding into position with quiet authority. "You were so focused on your attack that you missed my defense." Knight takes rook, then bishop to king's bishop 7, then queen takes queen. "Game over." Samuel stared at the board for a long moment, then began laughing. "When did you get so good at this?" 10 years of practice. When you only have yourself to play against, you learn to think several moves ahead. Thorne began resetting the pieces for another game. "Besides, someone had to get better." "You were always too impatient." Samuel agreed. "Amazing what a decade of undercover work will teach you about patience." The afternoon sun slanted through the pine needles, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the chessboard. In the distance, smoke rose from Pine Ridge's chimneys, marking the peaceful routines of families who no longer needed to fear mysterious disappearances or midnight visits from territorial marshals with forged warrants. Thorne pulled Samuel's compass from his pocket, setting it beside the chessboard where it caught the light. The brass surface was still scratched from its fall in the canyon, but the needle pointed true north with unwavering certainty. "Ready for another game?" he asked. Samuel nodded, his eyes bright with the competitive spirit that had driven him to fight corruption for 15 years. "Always, but this time I'll be more careful about my defense." "Good," Thorne replied, moving his first pawn. "Because I've got nowhere else to be." The compass needle held steady as the brothers began their game, pointing toward true north while they rebuilt the bond that had guided them through the wilderness of deception and loss. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and patient, keeping their secrets while the seasons turned and justice, finally served, settled into the landscape like snow on distant peaks.